So today we're going to talk about identity services. But before we do that, I grabbed this little clip from the Cisco Talos Intelligence Quarterly Threat Report. And it mentions in there that telecommunications and education were the most targeted verticals at 30%, or sorry, 20% each of the total number of incidents. So you guys are targets, you really are. There's a lot of PII out there, a lot of student data, some financial data, counseling records, and a lot of times K-12 have trouble getting budgets passed. So as I'm sure you guys are aware, welcome. So we'll go back to identity services now. I find it helpful to kind of go through the evolution of access control, which has evolved into identity services up to now. And this is how it used to be yesteryear. So, your ability to control access to critical data was done mainly through application login, maybe domain login. You might have done some role-based access control with minimal access within applications. Very crude, basic with segmentation more for traffic control than for security. But there wasn't really any concern for control access to the physical network infrastructure. People really didn't care if somebody walked in and plugged in and got on the network because they counted on their application security to keep them out of the critical, away from the critical data assets. That times have changed now as there's been more, as we've evolved now, we have connectivity to the internet, obviously internet email about for a long time now, remote access to the internet facing applications is just different now. Now it's hard to really define where the perimeter, where the edge of the network is. So we need to make sure we control our physical network infrastructure. So the new concerns now, email attacks, phishing, malware, command and control, ransomware extortion, and internet-based intrusions. So a lot of these can be sourced from unauthorized access to the physical network infrastructure, right? The ability to probe these application defenses. Right now it is not okay. So if now you hear or know or discover that there's an intruder in your network and they're not necessarily in your applications or haven't gained access to your critical systems, but they're inside your network probing, nobody's going to be comfortable with that now, right? As opposed to how that was yesteryear. So that's sort of a newer thing. So let me walk through a scenario here. Skippy Smith works at ABC School Corp. And Skippy, his laptop is in the shop, right? You guys hear that squeaky noise? I don't know where that's coming from. I sat back there too, don't know. Anyway, Skippy Smith, his laptop's in the shop. It's in with IT, it's broken, and you know how long those guys can take to get things fixed, right? So he has taken upon himself to use his Windows 8 personal laptop to be able to just get work done. So he brings it into work, sets it down, plugs it into his IP phone. He's on the network. He pings a few servers everywhere. He does not restrict it. He can ping whatever he wants. And starts getting some work done. Later on, Skippy needs to go to the conference room to go into a meeting. He jumps on the wireless. It's just a pre-shared key. The pre-shared key hasn't been changed in 10 years. So now he's on the network and he's doing his thing. When he goes back, he decides he wants to listen to some music. So he gets his iPhone, he looks for the guest network, he chooses it, it's just connected, and he's happily listening to yacht rock for the rest of the day. Takes his laptop home, realizes he has some more work to do, VPNs in, and does a little more work from home, and he's had a very productive day. So what's the problem? Okay, so in no particular order, is Windows 8, which is out of support. It's not controlled or managed by the company. So who knows what disposition it is. If it's patched, if it's compromised, if it's running ransomware, if it's running malware, you have no idea what's going on with it. So he comes in, he plugs into the phone, and he's on the network. See a problem there? Right? So he shouldn't be permitting personal devices physical connectivity to the production network. And he also goes into the wireless and connects to the wireless. All it is a pre-shared key. What if anybody gets hold of that pre-shared key? They're on the production network and able to do whatever they can do to probe the defenses of your network, right? He goes home, he connects with a VPN. Should he be connecting with his personal device over VPN to the corporate network. No, again, what else is on its network at home? When you VPN in, you're extending your network to their network, right? So there needs to be some things that need to be worked on. So now we'll talk in general about zero trust that'll lead us to identity services. Zero trust in a nutshell, the former approach was access to everything except exceptions, right? We'll let you, we're gonna, in other words, if you flip that, we're gonna block these threatening things and allow you to get anything else access, right? That's how it used to be for decades. And now we've realized that we have to flip that to be the zero trust approach, which is a model saying you get access to nothing except exceptions. So to flip that, it's you have this access and everything else is denied, right? Does that make sense, zero trust? And zero trust is like, trying to get to the speed of light. You can't quite get there, right? Any physics geeks here? You're never gonna quite get there because it's always just out of reach. So zero trust is just a model where you're trying to improve. You're trying to get to sort of zero-er trust, if you will, right? You're trying to get closer to that goal. Okay. So the basics of zero trust are: who are you? What are you connecting with? Or who and or what are you? Prove it. And then are you, how compliant are you? Are you compromised? And then once you've authenticated, where are you allowed to go to after you've gotten connected? That's the access control part. So your zero trust sort of authentication methods and considerations, of course, going basic, are just username and password, like let's say Active Directory username and password, or an open LDAP for Google users, right? Authentication. Ideally, you want multi-factor authentication using any of those methods listed up there. A user or machine certificate, right, to make sure that your machine is permitted to connect to the network. And then compliance to make sure that your machine isn't compromised. Compliance is what kind of machine are you, what's the operating system, do you have certain antivirus installed, and then your security disposition, that's are you compromised. And then segmentation, where are you allowed to get to once you're on there, and how fine, granular do you want to get with that, which we'll talk about more. Okay, so to bring it down to the basics, the three methods of connectivity to your physical network are wired, wireless, or remote access VPN or client VPN. And we'll talk about each of those here shortly. All right, and now we're going to go into identity service. So identity services does not have to be complex. It seems very daunting with a lot of gears, but it's like most other things that are very complex when you break it down to your elementary parts, that it's not too hard to understand. Okay, AAA, authentication, authorization, and accounting, that's what identity services is. Authentication is who are you, prove it, by means of a username or password, maybe a certificate. Authorization is now that you're authenticated, where you're allowed to have access to, and then your accounting is, I have on record who was authenticated and where they were given access to, within the context of wired, wireless, and remote access VPN. Okay? So, use cases for identity services. Now that we've covered kind of the basics. Guest access. When people come in, and guest is really how you define guest is kind of relative. So what is a guest? Is it, are your students, do you consider them guests? Or when parents come in or visitors to an event, are they considered guests? So that's something first you need to define first. And then when they get on, they're allowed to get access just to the internet, right? So that's a differentiation between BYOD, which I'll talk about shortly. Secure wired, secure wireless, and VPN access, so we'll break these each down. And access visibility, meaning what's connecting to my network. Again, each of these I'll go into a little bit more. Compliance, BYOD, device administration, segmentation, rapid threat containment, all these that are listed, let's just dig into those. So guest access. The other day I went to a Coliseum, not this Coliseum, but a Coliseum, okay? So, and I went to the Coliseum for an event, and the cellular strength was not strong enough for me, right? So I had to get on and look and see if they have a guest network. I chose it, and it said you have to create your credentials before you can use our guest network. That's one instance and a real use case of guest onboarding. So there's three sort of methods of guest access, and it depends on the audience or who the client is as to which one's right for you. You might have more than one of these or all of these. First one is just a hotspot, meaning you select the network, it'll pop up a page that says, please don't abuse my network. You click OK, and you're on. That's really easy from the user perspective, and then oftentimes it's appropriate for certain audiences. But you have really no way of tracking who connected at that point, other than just, you might be able to say, oh, I see that an iPhone connected, I see that an Android connected, whatever. But you're not going to know who. So hotspot, let's say use cases of that might be for your basketball games, your parent-teacher conferences, your events, your band concert or whatever, where you just want people to get on the internet easily, but you also want to cover yourself by saying, I want this AUP up there saying, don't abuse our network. Okay, does that make sense? Yeah. Next use case for guests is self-registered guest, where the user chooses the network, and then it pops up and says, all right, you fill out this form. What's your name? Let's say, what's your email address? Whatever else you want to collect from them, it's all configurable. And then we will email you what your credentials will be. So now you get a bit more visibility as to who's connecting because you've got an email address associated with that. Now, yeah, you can do those email sort of spoofing things if you wanted to do that, but still, it provides you some method of tracking down that says, hey, Skip S at google.com, connected at this time, and then there was a problem. So a little bit more visibility and a little bit more control, and mitigates sort of, parking lot surfing, if you will. You know what I mean? People just driving by and trying to get within access and get on the internet. And then the last use case is sponsor guest, and this is the tighter one where somebody has to, like a guest ambassador will create an account for you. You've gone to places and you go in there and say, here's your login. Right, you use this to log in. That's sponsored guest. Somebody creates that and controls it. For all these cases, you can say how long these credentials are for, how good it's for, until they need to re-register again. Much more tracking, you know exactly who you're giving your login to, except for a specific use case I had with one K-12 where they like to do when there was, let's say, a basketball game, a sign that says, here's your Wi-Fi credentials for tonight. And they would just update that every time there was a game, and we configured it such that those sets of credentials could have 900 people log into it at the same time, right? And that way it's just good for that night, maybe 2 days or 1 day or however long you need it to be, great for an event. And then, again, you don't know who's using that, but at least it's controlled, right? So any questions on any of those three guest onboarding use cases? Okay, all right. And now I'm going to cover sort of three at once. Secure wireless access, secure wired access, and secure client VPN access. Right. So talking about wired and wireless access. The more or less the method of how those attach are the same. Yes, one is wired and one is wireless, but what goes on from an access control standpoint is the same. So your endpoints that have an 802.1x supplicant. So that is software that runs on modern operating systems, Windows, Mac OS, iOS, Android, Chromebook, Linux, that will supplicate to say, I want access to your network, right? Supplicate means to beg for something, right? So I'm begging, I want to get on your network. And so that allows this sort of negotiation to come back and say, okay, what's your username and your password? And so that username and password can be any number of things. It can be local on the identity services machine, or it can be Active Directory, it can be Open LDAP, several things. It might also say, I need a certificate from you. Here's my certificate, you have to trust that, and I want to see your certificate, and I need to trust that. So then that's when you need to have a little bit of PKI, public key infrastructure, in place, where those two certificates are issued from a CA that's trusted by both parties, right? So that's a good method of controlling, again, to make sure that only corporate-owned assets are getting on the network. And then you can also tack onto that compliance status. So compliance is done, I think I might have a slide on this, but I'll touch on it now. with a piece of software that actually runs as an agent that has the ability to query that machine to say, what operating system do you have, or do you have disk encryption, or is your desktop firewall enabled, or do you have one of these list of supported antivirus, etc. To be for compliancy, to make sure that it's on there. Okay, but what if you have something that does not have an 802.1x supplicant? So an IoT device, right? A wireless camera. I don't know, any of you things in maybe a robotics lab that are controlled with the internet by the internet, or anything that maybe does have an 802.1x supplicant, but you don't control that because 802.1x requires some configuration. Okay. So for those, you can authenticate by using either their MAC address, where you just plug in the MAC address or it's registered, and or you can do device profile, where it'll try to learn from that from the network what type of machine that is, and I'll talk about that a little more. Or you can do both. You can do 802.1x plus map. Okay. Any questions on those? Okay. Secure client VPN access. So similar, a lot of people don't spend enough attention on their remote access VPN so far as what they are requiring for that. So it's similar to what's in 802.1x, user authentication, Active Directory, Open LDAP, local authentication, a certificate. You can even do compliance status, and definitely can control where you have access to once you're logged in, depending on who you are or what group you're in. Oh, you're in IT, you get access to everything. Oh, you're in, I don't know, one of the groups you have limited access. Okay, does that make sense? Yeah, just tighten it down. It doesn't need to be binary where it's like you get all access or you get no access. You can tighten it down. Okay. And asset visibility enforcement or device profiling, I talked about that a little bit. So when you're connecting either to a wireless access point or to a switch wired, that switch or that network access device, either one of those, generic term, also can be called an authenticator in identity services talk. That authenticator can glean attributes from the traffic to learn what type of endpoint is connecting. So that authenticator will learn attributes as you're authenticating, because an endpoint's not going to come out and say, hey, I'm Windows 11. It's just going to connect, but you can glean from it through DNS, DHCP, LLDP, CDP, and many other DPs, right? You can get on there, learn what kind of endpoint this is. Now that is educated guess, right? It's an educated guess. I think this is this, but I'm getting more and more hints that are supporting that hypothesis, right? And so that comes in as what can be called like a confidence level to say scale of 100, 90% chance this is an iPad. Right? And you can tune that to be more specific, to look for specific attributes that are pertaining to specific endpoints. Then you can set up a policy based on device type. For example, your IP phones, well, they go in the voice VLAN, right? Your IP cameras, they go in a segment that's dedicated to your cameras. Maybe you want iPads to be in have a particular downloadable access list, right? So you can control those by device, because those devices cannot log in. Right? There's no way to log in, so then you can use that way. Does that make sense? Everyone, any questions? Okay. Compliance then, also called posture, is the ability, again, that uses a client, and that client runs and queries that system. So that has to be pre-installed. Well, there are options now to do some sort of clientless trickery, a lot of times where it can come through, but it still requires some sort of elevated privileges to be able to query that system to say, what are you? And I want to know all the things about you, right? So you can come through and say, oh, you're not up to snuff, I'm not going to let you on my network, right? Does that make sense? Yeah. And then BYOD. So BYOD is where you want to, let me differentiate BYOD from guest. Guest is internet only. BYOD is internet plus maybe some internal resources. One or two things, that one system everyone needs to get to on the inside, right? So it's different from guest, and you need to have some additional credentials and authentication mechanisms to make sure that only authorized people are permitted to get on there. So here's how that works. First of all, the best BYOD policy is no BYOD policy. If you can get away with not doing it, do that. But there are instances where you must. So for some people, if they're a use case, then you just have to work through it. And so here's how it works. They connect to, let's say, a wireless LAN from a machine that is 802.1x compliant, but is not managed. Then they are redirected to a portal page, and that portal page goes through a sort of client provisioning. And that client provisioning will give them a certificate. Well, first you got to log in with some good credentials, say your Active Directory credentials or your Open LDAP credentials to prove who you are. Then it gives you a certificate, an identity certificate that's trusted by the identity services system. And then it configures the 802.1x supplicant. Goes through all the little settings. If you ever go into a wireless network and go into authentication, there's tons of little settings there. So this configures that for you, so then it's all set. It's not unlike if you're to use an MDM and you were to push out wireless configuration to be just so, right? Just like that. And then when they log in, of course, the access control, you can specify what they need to have access to, the internet and maybe that one system or two. The challenge with BYOD is that there are a lot of different endpoints. So there's Windows, there's Mac OS, there's iOS, there's Android, there's Chrome, there's Linux, there's fill in the blank. And all those things act differently. And actually, the version of software on each of those respectively act differently. So it can be challenging to keep up on BYOD, but it is a thing that can be possible to roll out. Okay, any questions on BYOD? Difference between that and guess and what we're doing today? Okay. Device administration is a special use case. And that's for your IT guys that need to administer your network infrastructure, or gals who need to administer your network infrastructure. So it might be that you have 200 or 300 switches, each with their own local credentials. And so when your IT team goes out there, hopefully they have the right credentials for each of those switches, wireless access points, firewalls to get there. And oh, by the way, when they leave, now you got to change all those if you're doing the right thing. Or you don't, and you accept the risk. So that's a pain, right? Instead, that would tie into identity services, which then would tie into your Active Directory or Open LDAP, et cetera, where you log in with those credentials, and then you can have access to each of those network devices. And not just that, but granular access. Well, you can do these commands, but not these commands, if you chose to do that. And the really great thing, I think the best thing is that gives the opportunity to tie into MFA. So now you're logging in with, say, Active Directory credentials, plus you need to get your MFA on there just before you're in there. So that's super cool for access control, and for when that IT gal or guy leaves, then you can, all you have to do is disable their account, and you're done, right? You don't have to go through all these different things, especially if they're left on maybe not the best terms, right? So, and when you onboard a new engineer, all you have to do is add them to the appropriate group, poof, they're in. So very handy. Also, you know who logged in when and did. That's also handy. Okay? So any questions on that, device administration? It's kind of going off, yeah. Micro-segmentation. How are we doing? Okay. Oh, I'm good. Good to go. So you all are familiar with access lists, right? You put access lists at your layer 3 edge, maybe your switch VLAN interfaces or on router interfaces, and it controls access between subnets, okay? As granular as you want to get. But again, if you have 300 of these multi-layer switches, each with their own SVIs and their own access list, that's cumbersome to maintain all of those, right? And if you need to make changes, you got to go to all of those and do that. So instead, you can leverage what's called group-based policy enforcement. In that model, in this model, a user logs in, and depending on who they log in as, they're given a tag. Here's your tag. Security group tag has a number and a name, kind of like a VLAN, if you will, right? There's a number associated with it and a name. You're in this group. Then the servers, or the destinations, if you will, they also are assigned a static group, a tag, a security group tag. Then within your identity services system, you can configure granular control between those groups in one matrix. So why would you want to do that? Because let's say you're saying, I need to get more granular than doing these static access lists that are on all these switch VLAN interfaces, for example. I want to do downloadable access lists. So you can, your identity services system, you can configure access list, so when they log in, it downloads an access list to that network endpoint, or to the network device, rather. Which is all good and fine, except when you have 100 people logging into that same switch, they each download their own access list. They don't reuse that. That's like adding another access list for every user on that switch. That's stored in what's called a CAM, let's just say system resources on that switch, which is finite. So it's limited. You can overload that, and then you just can't put any more in there. It's just got limited memory, if you will, right? So the way around that is to do this group-based access policy enforcement. And then the switch, when you're doing it this way, the switch then can look at that matrix and say, I'm only going to pull the pieces out of there that pertain to me being the switch. Right? It's just going to pull down those things, so it keeps it lean. It doesn't need to download anything else. And that policy on that switch is reused by anybody that's coming through there, so it's not dynamic. So you see the benefit of doing that? Also, once you get it rolled out, it's a lot easier. You're not going to 300 places to make all these changes or changing all these access lists. You just need to tweak the matrix, okay, on the identity services system. Does that make sense? Any questions on that from anybody? Yeah? Okay. Integration, security ecosystem integrations. This means that an identity services system can pass contextual security information to other security controls. So, a lot of these security controls you might have need to be able to identify the client or the connector or the host, whatever you want to call it, before it can do any sort of enforcement. And how does it do that? Instead of having to go through all that over again, it can just go look to identity services, which just says, oh, I know exactly who that is. That's this person. And they, I know everything about them. So use this, and then you can apply policy for it. So an example of that might be setting up firewall rules based on a security group tag or based on Active Directory group member, right? So instead of just IP to IP and protocol, you can do it based on, a group name, security group tag. Let's see. So let me see if I passed one on here. Yes, I did. An example of that is threat containment. So threat containment is a special type of integration with another system, because identity services comes in and it says, who are you and what are you, and it provides access, then it gets out of the way, right? But it's not watching for threatening traffic. That's not what identity services does. It's like the guard at a secure building. He lets you through, and then you're bye. He's not looking at you anymore. But if you have something else on the inside that's watching what you're doing, then they can talk back to ISO. For example, if you have something that can tell vulnerabilities, that scans vulnerabilities on whatever's connected, or can tell if something is infected with malware, then those systems can talk to then identity services, which can then do a change of authorization to say, whoa, I'm going to pull you out of the network and put you in this remediation segment so you can get yourself fixed, right? Scope, contain, remediate, right? Just to put it together to get them out. Does that make sense, how those security integrations can work? Are we using that? Yeah. Okay. So what about Skippy at ABC Co? So the right way for Skippy to have, to have that worked out for him would be, his laptop is dead, have some spares. He comes into you and says, my laptop's dead. You say, here's your spare. So if they're following your security policy, they're not storing any documents on their endpoint. So it doesn't matter what laptop they use, right? Because it's all on either the file system or in a cloud somewhere. So you just say, here you go, and you take it back from them. So they don't have to resort to using their insecure personal device. Also, set policy in place that says you're not allowed to use your personal device on a production network. You're not allowed to connect wired, wireless, or VPN, okay? No, just following that, that's not too inconvenient for anybody who has this, right? He still has to tell you there's a problem. And trying to get their personal devices on the network is a pain anyway. So any questions on that? Access control, right? Okay. All right, so takeaways, guest onboarding, you got hotspot, self-registered, or sponsored guest, secure wireless access, or secure wired access, either of those using 802.1x, Active Directory or Open LDAP authentication, public key infrastructure, certificate exchange, or you can use MAC addresses, or you can use device profiling. Secure client VPN access, again, username, password, MFA, and posture if you choose to do that. Secure device administration to make it easy to onboard your engineers or offboard them. And compliance to make sure that only the types of machines that you want are on your production network by manufacturer, by what software they have installed on them, or what patch level, what OS. So that's compliance. Security ecosystem integrations allow your individual security components to work together as a security system, right? So they're working together, like that picture I showed you with the cogs in the machine, right? And then threat containment, so that if something happens, either prior to them being given access, or when they've already been given access, if something comes up, to be able to pull them out of the production system, put them into remediation. Make sense?